All right, you all. Before we get to it, we're going to thank just a couple of our sponsors while we're moving things around. Mountain Valley is keeping us hydrated. They've been extraordinary. And our friends, Adam and Christy Dirks with livery cars, I think some of you panelists had a heck of a drive into town, maybe. And Michael Morris with French Market Coffee, my favorite. And our friends and family at Crystal Hot Sauce, thank you very much for being here today. My darling Pepper, I hope y'all get to meet him. This panel is going to be a bit different. It's about a topic near and dear to all restaurateurs' heart. What is going on in the world of food writing? Pretty much every chef and restaurateur I met last night asked if they could be the moderator of this panel. It's been an incredible and interesting year to read or watch videos about food, hospitality, and the industry news. Here to ask the questions we've always wanted to ask ourselves is my dear friend, Walter Isaacson. Come on out whenever you're ready, Walter, sweetheart.
Hey.
I have to give him a hug.
I want a hug.
I want a hug.
I don't. Thank you for doing this, Steve.
Walter is a professor of history at Tulane and an advisory partner at Perella Weinberg, a financial services firm based in New York. He is the past CEO of the Aspen Institute, where he's now a distinguished fellow, and has been the chairman and CEO of CNN and the editor of Time magazine. You see where they sold Time yesterday?
Yeah.
You see they sold the magazine. Anyway, he also came out of Newman High School and the Times-Picayune. Walter has authored some of the most compelling biographies, including Leonardo da Vinci, The Innovators, How a Group of Hackers, Geniuses, and Geeks Created the Digital Revolution, Steve Jobs, Einstein, His Life and Universe, and the list goes on and on. Listen to this is new. He is also host of Amanpour and Company, a new show on PBS and CNN. I am so excited about this. Walter is from New Orleans and serves on the board of United Airlines, the New Orleans City Planning Commission, the New Orleans Tricentennial Commission, Bloomberg Philanthropies, the Rockefeller Foundation, and more. I hope the panelists are ready for this one. Walter's going to do a rapid-fire Q&A session with Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times journalist Kim Severson, local and national food critic, and Harvard fellow Brett Anderson. So this is going to be fun.
All right.
Y'all have fun.
Great.
No, you sit. No, I'll sit. Okay.
I'm going to start with you, Kim.
We did an air kiss. Did you notice that? I thought that was really good.
We did? Yeah,
Yeah,
I don't know why.
We
yeah.
did real ones downstairs.
That's because they
That's
put makeup on us, and I
No,
feel like we're
I
kind of
know.
sticky.
I know. You feel a little bit gay, don't you? It's
Yeah,
nice.
well,
you look good.
Thank you, thank
Makeup.
you.
I like that.
Yeah, well, you should have seen me without it. Let's start by figuring out the path that got you here, because we're talking about food writing and how it changed. Both of you were actual real journalists, believe it or not. Something that I'm
We
not
might argue
sure-
we still are.
Yeah, well, they don't mint as many actual real journalists who know how to, go out and report a story. So, Kim, start with your path.
We were talking. I was really one of those post-Watergate babies, so we all saw the Watergate thing happen and ran off to journalism school and thought we could change the world, which, didn't really work out so well, but we tried. And but I worked, back in the day when you could work at a small paper and you were always chasing circulation, so you'd cover cops in courts at, a 40,000 circulation paper, and, then you'd move to, try to get one of the regional papers. And so I kind of worked my way up in Tacoma, and I worked at the Anchorage Daily News. I was actually the food critic at the Anchorage Daily News for a short time. I always tell people it's like being the best ballerina in Lubbock, Texas. But I started writing about food, and then I got a break, and Michael Bauer, who's recently retiring from the San Francisco Chronicle, hired me, and this was in the late 90s when food news it was really hard to get a food story on the front page of the paper of any kind. It was sort of pre-Michael Pollan, and people were just starting to see that the connection between food and how we ate and health and
obesity.
The childhood obesity had just been declared an epidemic, and the appetite for food stories by the gentlemen who were running the news desk was not high, but was starting. It was always hard to go and be like, "Hi, we're like the food people. We have a story we think is news," and they'd be like, "Oh, that's."
One always has the impression that San Francisco was in the lead in figuring out that food was journalism.
No, absolutely.
So
And
you were part of that.
And I really do credit, I know Michael Bauer's taken a lot of hits back and forth as a critic and what he did, but he's been there for 34 years and really did champion getting that telling food stories from the plate was as valid news as it was from telling a food story from the Farm Bill Committee in Congress, and that was a pretty groundbreaking. Also, Marion Burroughs at the New York Times was doing the same thing for a long time too. So that was, it took a while for news organizations to see food as news, and also, it's along with the rise of food as kind of cultural currency, and so it became more, more of value to the people who were running the front page.
And Brad, your path from Minneapolis?
My path was I did not have the same sort of Watergate-inspired drive that Kim did. I wanted to be a rock and roll writer. That was the only thing I ever wanted to do. And, I grew up reading Rolling Stone magazine, and Village Voice, which actually just closed its business for good, was a big inspiration to me. But I got my first job writing about rock music. I was 20 years old in Minneapolis, and that was kind of my first break. It was for a weekly newspaper, and I was hired by a guy who had just recently gotten out of drug rehab for the third time, but he turned out to be a really excellent journalist. His name was David Carr, and that was a real...
Yeah, everybody knows David Carr.
That was a real break for me, and what he really instilled in me is that I worked for him in my first two jobs. I moved from there to Washington, D.C., where I started writing a food column for a weekly paper there called City Paper, and that was David's idea. And from there, I came to New Orleans, but David really instilled in me and everyone on his staff that you weren't allowed to say, like, oh, I only write this kind of story, or I'm just a critic. You always had to be able to do general assignment reported stories, which I did a lot in Washington, D.C., and that's really been something that was expected of me when I moved to New Orleans. I moved here in 2000, and the critic chair here has always included a reporting piece. You always have to report news and write features and that kind of thing, so I've always worn both hats.
Starting with music criticism and music reporting, when you were doing that, did you make a distinction between being a critic who would review a performance, review a new album, and being a reporter who reported on the music industry?
I would, but the style of piece is different, right? Like the criticism piece is your voice, it's your opinion, and so forth. And a reported piece is you going out and finding a story and telling it to your reader in the voice of the people who know how to tell it best. But I also do maintain that being a critic requires you to have that curiosity that a reporter has. For instance, I moved to New Orleans. I had been here once when I became the restaurant critic at the Times-Picayune, and that required a lot of me learning about this culture, about its food history and all that sort of stuff, and those are reporting muscles, asking people questions, reading, talking to as many people as you can to make sure that you are as informed as you can possibly be to be a critic. And I've always sort of looked at that part of the job as very much a digging job also.
And Kim, did you see that distinction in your career?
Between criticism and reporting, I think, I don't like I don't like being a food critic very much. I'm not very good at it. I think there's some real distinctive forms, and particularly in the news business, there's like a great form for writing a great baseball story. There's a great form for obituary writing. There's a great form for criticism. And critics, I think, have this innate ability to want to be very binary, say yes or no, this was good or bad. And then the art comes with, if you have a whole thing saying yes or no through this whole piece of writing, the art comes with how you say that and how you put it in cultural context. And it's a very difficult job, and I'm really terrible at it. And I think that criticism, there are some people who are just natural critics and who do a really great job. I think Brett's one of them. I think there's just, Ruth was a fantastic critic, and where you take this thing you're doing, do you like the dish or not? It's kind of consumer journalism, and you make it this beautiful cultural piece that means something more than just yes or no. So I think there's criticism, and it's a thing, and I'm not very good at it. I'm much more of a reporter in that I just want to find out what's happening and tell people about it. It's give it context, and that's really what drives me. And I think good critics are reporters. You have to be. You have to know what's happening around you. You have to understand the context of what you're writing about. But there's an artfulness to it, and I suppose there's art to news writing too, and feature writing. But I just want to. I just want to tell somebody a good story and say what's happening.
What are the trends now in food reporting that you find interesting?
Reporting? There's not a lot of it. I find that interesting. We were talking about this backstage a little bit, that there's a ton of food journalism out there right now. There's a ton of food writing, and there are a lot of people who are, it's way bigger than when we were talking, food, there was not food writing wasn't a thing as much as it is now. And there's tons of people behind their computers giving you their hot take on whatever. and all of that's very interesting and vibrant. But there are fewer and fewer news organizations and people who have food writers who pick up the phone and call somebody and ask, did this happen? Who get documents, who look at things, who talk to a lot of people before they form an opinion or of news stories. So I think that there is hopefully will be more hardcore pick up the phone reporting happening among all these hundreds of thousands of people who are writing about food. So I think I would like to see more of that. I do think I can go online, I could spend all day online just bouncing around. Instagram's a really cool form of food journalism now. I sometimes think that we just that food has become the way that we're all learning how to be to go through this digital transformation we're going through, right? Like we can pass around pictures of food and learn how to use this new technology, and we can.
But when you say
it's
Instagram is food journalism,
Absolutely.
you're talking mainly about the pictures that people
it's
post?
absolutely a way of. Don't you think that it's
No.
kind of a new form of food
It's a way to
journalism? So
communicate.
you find what people are eating. If you want to figure out where to go eat in a town, just pick a chef in that town or pick a chef that you like and see last time they were in that city where they went and ate, and they snapped a few pictures of where they were eating, and you kind of learn what's happening.
But call me old-fashioned, but that doesn't feel like food journalism to me.
Well, it's moving a lot faster. It's like real-time reporting, essentially. You have people with points of view out there taking real-time image of something that they're doing or eating or being part of. It's very unfiltered. It perhaps doesn't have the nuance. It's up to people are much more informed now, right? So you can look at that picture on Instagram and go, oh, that's bullshit, or it's not, or I think this is great, or I think it's not. You can comment on it. It's a kind of a new form of community journalism. It's not unlike a really fast-paced letters to the editor section, right? So somebody will post a picture, 80 people will say, that's ridiculous, that's not, I love it, I don't. And you have this thing. That's a community gathering and discussion.
So do you think that
That's journalism.
crowdsourced social media type food stuff is replacing what I would call, for lack of a better term, the professional food writer?
I wouldn't say it's replacing it, but I think it's making us work a lot harder.
How does
And
it change
I
it?
think it's enhancing it, and I think it's up to us then to help sort through all that. It's like a big tent, and it's the circus is going on in there, and increasingly you need good trained journalists to help you give the tent posts. I think we're seeing that, in politics and everything else, increasingly, in this era of fake news, you need the real, people and organizations you can trust to help you sort through that cacophony. But the cacophony is it's kind of great that it's much more transparent now, and it's, I think it's more dynamic. It's better for the culture. But I think increasingly, more than ever, you need us, like #fake news. You need the real journalists in there helping you sort out what's what.
Yeah, but there is
you agree, sir?
Yeah.
As it pertains to social media, I do think that those platforms are driving the conversation in ways that, they didn't exist when I started out as a journalist. And that's something we need to respond to. To me, that's like source material a lot of time is coming up in the way that you explained it. I also find a challenge is that when I write something, often people will come upon it on social media, and whoever hipped them to it on social media will have told that person what's in the story. They don't read the story. They come back to me giving me shit about something I wrote. I'm like, I didn't write that.
Yeah.
It drives the conversation in a really complex way that I'm not quite sure I feel comfortable that we're reacting to it in the best way yet.
Is that settling down, though, you think, a little bit? Because increasingly...
Depends on what the story is, But I find that challenging. And
Tell me about the social media feedback on your John Besh series and how it came about.
And we're done. Thank you. No.
There was a lot of it from my perspective, and I feel that the phenomenon I just described really was profound from where I sit and where it came to that, and of course, Me Too. The hashtag itself, is a social media phenomenon. So I think in a different time, not as many people would have read that story, pre-social media. I've told people when I moved to town here in 2000, in 2001, I wrote what would have been the most viral story I ever wrote had that term existed. And it was about sexual harassment. It was about a waiter at Galatoire's who was fired for sexual harassment. And, big Sunday living section story. I spent all this time reporting about the public's reaction and all that sort of stuff. And so I don't know. I get the reason I bring that up is that it's a topic that presses people's buttons, and it's something I've had firsthand experience with, dating before the John Bash piece. And social media has a lot to do with it. And I'm not really sure, when I start hearing reflected back at me from sources, things about something I wrote that aren't true, I don't feel entirely comfortable about how I should be reacting to that as a journalist. My instinct is to just be like, the chatter, you can't deal with it. But that was a particular instance where it was sort of outside the norm of what I normally do. And so we'll see. It's an ongoing
Kim, how has social media changed the way you work?
Well, it is a great reporting tool. I mean, this is just a small example, but, I was doing some national desk reporting before I got back to food here, and I was covering a tornado a few years ago, a series of tornadoes. I don't remember when all those tornadoes cut through Alabama. And so I was supposed to write a follow-up story about how this was prompting this huge uptick in the sale of these little shelters that you would bury in your backyard, and you could go in for these tornado shelters. So I happened to see a photo I was following a bunch of people who were caught up in the tornadoes, and I saw this kid who posted a picture of his mom, and she was standing in front of her tornado shelter, and her house was gone. He's like, look at my mom. She didn't, die because of this shelter. So I could find him on social media. I sent him my phone number. I said, can I just talk to you real quick? He's like, yeah. I said, God, can I talk to your mom? It sounds like a crazy story. And she's like, oh my God, yeah, I just didn't die last night because of my shelter. And so there I have the lead of my story, right? And this all happened in the course of a couple hours, right? So I've got it in the story and up on the front page about, with all the other reporting about how you couldn't sell enough tornado shelters. So in the old days, it would have taken forever to get to somebody who was in the neighborhood who maybe you could, but so like the speed with which I can report using social media is fantastic. And the ability to just scan what's happening in the world is fantastic. And if you look at what happened with, and the Me Too reporting is like that, people can find me now, and I can find people in ways that never happened before. And that's fantastic. I can also, tap into what's happening much quicker. What's like kind of, when is a trend about to pop? Do you see are there three, have I seen 3 pictures of matcha soft serve? Is that a trend? Is it like whatever. So that's the great thing. The downside is that it's hard to know what's really a trend, what's just visually interesting so that people are talking about it. There's a bunch of, like Brett says, just so much crap out there that isn't real and isn't, and we're seeing it in the Me Too stuff. There is, I think, like on Twitter, there are some really vocal voices. I think it keeps other people from wanting to jump in the discussion because they're afraid they're going to get creamed for something. I'm much less likely to engage on Twitter anymore than I used to be. It's just not, I'm happy to use it to, put forth stuff I think is interesting, our own stuff. But, you don't want to, it's so easy to get into an argument with somebody and then you're like, who is this person? And they really are that in their parents' basement in a bathrobe telling you whatever. And you're like
Usually
spending your
in
time.
St. Petersburg, they're
Yeah, so
Russian
it's crazy. I'm like, why am I even, but on the other hand, I do know that generationally there are, people, young folks who are, really much more adept and really live in that world, and it's much easier for them to blow off the bad comments and, I take everything so personally, and I'm like, oh, well.
You said you can find what trends are about to pop through Instagram and whatever. Tell me 2 trends that you think are going to pop soon.
Oh my God, 2 trends I think, that is folly. I will not.
In the world of post-kale
I'll tell you
salad.
something. I think everybody keeps trying to get us to eat insects. I don't think that's going to happen.
No, insects.
So what?
Insects.
It's not
Although
gonna
you
happen.
can go, the Lemon Kid, Steve Lemon, at the Insectarium right here, about
Never going to
4
happen.
blocks away.
Yeah.
You can eat.
Yeah, you can eat them, and they're not
Right,
good.
but why would you do that? Yeah, I mean, I know. I'm not saying there are many cultures in which eating is. I was just in Mexico eating ants. I understand that eating, but I think in America we're not going to eat insects. So that's one trend
we'll
that is
agree
not
a
going to happen.
non-trend, yes.
Kebabs. I always just say kebabs because everyone's like, oh yeah, kebabs. I have no idea if kebabs are going to be the next big thing.
But now they are, because you said it on
That's right.
stage at the Orpheum in
Kebabs.
front of the most
heard it here
influential group
first.
of people ever.
Kebabs.
In a week, we're going to see features on kebabs.
Matcha kebabs.
We're
That's
going to
what I
have
say.
kebabs at Sobu.
Right. Matcha kebabs with turmeric.
Are you making me do the trend?
Yeah, baby.
Oh,
I'm
yes,
not
sir.
doing that.
One thing I believe we're going to see that isn't food related, I think it's service related, is more playing around with the model of who's a server, who's a cook, as a way to address pay discrepancies in restaurants, which I think will be that's already starting to happen, and it has to do with tipping culture and so forth. But to me, that's a trend that's already
You
starting.
think tipping is going to go away?
Ugh.
Is Danny still here?
Maybe Danny should
Danny,
talk
are you
about
in the
that.
audience?
I don't. It's hard for me to say on that.
Danny?
I think it
Danny?
oughta, personally.
Should it?
I think it is. I think I think it's a big contributor to the hostile work environment piece of it, because it gives customers license to hold it against an employee for not responding to their behavior in the way that they desire it to. And I think that creates a culture of abuse in many
Kim?
ways.
I do think that I don't think restaurants can sustain the pay model of, where you have people in the front of house making so much money and cooks, I think, in the back not making very much money. And you've got to, that's got to even out somehow. And I think I never hear people saying I can't get enough good waiters as much as I hear them say they can't get enough good line cooks. So I would imagine that there's just as a business model, that's got to change. I think that sexual harassment, everybody, that's where any of us who have waited tables when we were, teenagers, that's where you learn to be sexually harassed, is waiting tables at the IHOP, right? So you're like, oh, this is how that works. Okay, thank you. It's a very important lesson as you're changing the boysenberry syrup, so that whole model of power imbalance and women, I'm hoping that will change, and that tipping culture will change, because the sexual harassment is we're in an era of realizing how deeply embedded sexual harassment is in our culture. So maybe that'll change. But I do think that Americans just like that idea of, I'll reward you, we'll reward us with cash, right? So you do a thing and I reward you with cash, and there's that aspirational nature. All Americans think they can be VIPs, right? We all love our VIP cards and our service, and if you buy 10 things here, you get to be in the VIP group. So that idea that we're VIPs at a table and that we will dispose of, give you our cash for good, that dynamic. We like to feel important, and tipping is one way we feel important. So I think it's going to be hard for Americans to break that. And also that idea that I don't think people get, when you tell people how much waiters make, that, small amount of money and they rely on tips, I think people are kind of appalled by that. So I don't know. It could happen. There's a lot of things that I never thought would change. It did. So I think the model could break. I think it's going to take some smart business owners in the restaurant level to make it work on lower levels, And
Will we
also,
ever see
I
a
don't know.
model in which there's sort of an electronic replacement of a lot of the front staff at a restaurant?
God, I hope not.
You see it in
People
fast
are trying.
food. Fast food. But
Yeah, I think as we're
in
more
casual
I
fast.
think it's going to be. It depends on the application. There's times where I just really don't want to deal with anybody. I just want to get my thing and go, because in an airport, wherever, I'm just But I think increasingly we want human connection in an age of technology, and
That's a
I think
good point.
that it's going to become more valuable to have people who we know who are cooking and serving and helping us. And I think we crave. It's why people still go to the movies, even though you can sit on your couch and watch
Right,
Netflix.
and
You
why we
wanna
go to
be
restaurants is we
in a
want
group
human
experience.
connections.
Yeah.
I
So I think
definitely
you're going to see just different. You're going to see more hunger for that experience of having someone cook and serve you food, and then quicker ways you can get food when you don't want to deal with people.
One trend in food writing, or one theme in food writing, has been the science and nutrition, et cetera. And that always, I love most food writers, but it always seemed a weakness that many food writers would write about these things, and they didn't delve into the science. They didn't know. And I plead guilty when I was at Time Magazine. Every time we were having trouble with newsstand sales and we need to pop on a newsstand, you do eggs are good for you, and then
Yeah.
you do eggs are bad for you,
Right.
you know, and it would sell either way.
Oatmeal.
Oh yeah, oatmeal good. Butter, is it good or bad? Cholesterol, good or
Right.
bad? Salt, good or bad? And yet, I don't think most food writers they sort of leap on the trend, whether it's this type of diet or that type of diet, but they don't really report on the science as much. Am I wrong on that?
I mean, I think that there are food writers who've done it well.
Michael Pollan.
And Kim.
Yeah.
I also think Corby Kummer has done it quite well at the
Correct.
Atlantic, back dating a long time ago.
And Tamar over at the Post is doing a
Yes,
great job.
I mean, there are examples out there. I think that it's broadly true what you say, that science for any journalist is, science is intimidating.
We can't even
right?
balance our checkbooks, let alone figure out science.
And a lot of times you're writing for a food section, like there's a business reason that journalistic organizations cover food, and that's because it's, generally speaking, a happy topic.
Right.
And it's about pleasure, and it's about a relief from everything else you're reading out there, and there's a tension there, right? Like, how much bad news do you guys want to hear from us? And I don't, I think that when it just comes to the assignment giving, people who fancy themselves food writers are going to get less of those. I do think that there's people on the science page, right, who handle this well.
And this is what, there's two things that are happening, like you say, that what we're seeing now, because as food is like now becoming such hot cultural currency, there are people on the science desk who are looking at food science with new eyes, and there's some value there to them. So you have people who know how to read a scientific study who now are taking up food, and where that can merge with sort of deliciousness and cooking, and I think those worlds are merging more. So I think you'll have science writers who are writing more about food, but in a way that is not just nutritive, is not just about does this have the right nutrients. The other thing that's happening is we're seeing a real, I think, collapse of this idea that the USDA and that we're going to calorically and nutritively work our way to health. So it's not like, well, we need X amount of grams of this and X amount of grams of that. And the science of that, which is driven by food companies a lot and also by large universities that are just studying nutrition, I think people are eating differently and they realize that they're taking control of their own health, and that whole foods and cooking, and there are all these ways that will make us healthier than just reading the grams on packaging. So I think we're having a collapse of or a change maybe in what food
But
science
also
means.
every 2 years brings a whole spate of an entirely new diet that then has the top 10
I think people are
books.
forever going to want to lose weight. And I remember, Marion Nestle always just said, it's really not that hard. It's calories in and calories out. And I think the bottom line is, like, I don't think people who are trying to get healthy and eat better, I don't think the problem is that they have not counted their grams. It's just like that big plate of fry. I mean, it's like quantity. It's like what we're, but I do think that, ever since the graham cracker was invented, ever since, people have been trying to eat their way to health for a long, long time, and that's still going to be great fodder for food journalists. And I still, when somebody says, oh, there's this new study that says you should eat X, I still look at it and go, maybe I should eat more X. That's right. And then I go back to what I'm doing. So
Go back to the red wine and
I think,
I love the red wine stuff.
Yeah, that
Are we
red wine
supposed to
good,
drink
red wine bad. Yeah. And real quick,
where are
and
we
I'm going to
now?
go to
Is
the
it-
audience.
Are we supposed to, are you supposed
That
to drink
the
red wine or
Harvard,
no?
in my
I don't
opinion,
listen to the
the
stuff
I
that
can't
says
drink any of it
study
anymore, so
was
whatever.
bunk. It was
Okay.
about included everything.
I just hung on
from,
the chocolate one.
drunk driving in the third world, and said, well, drinking is bad for you. It was not a convincing study to me, at least. But I don't know what you. Real quick, and then we'll get to the audience. Who are your favorite food writers from all time? The Calvin Trillins, or people who wrote about food in a literary way?
Well, Calvin Trillin, of course, Brett Anderson, of course, but Ruth, is Ruth still here?
Yeah, Ruth Reichl.
Yeah, she was like one of my biggest influences in my life, and only because there were many reasons, but that idea, that freedom she had to write, I mean, she just wrote with a certain amount of rule breaking and freedom, and was really one of the first women who had a looseness and a confidence when she wrote. There were certainly other great women food writers, but an unconstrained freedom, and that huge influence on me in ways that I can't even begin to say.
And
So
Mimi Sheridan.
Mimi was great because Mimi was a reporter, and what I learned from Mimi, she would drive around in her car with like 80 corned beef sandwiches that she had collected and sit and eat them all and tell you which one was good and which one was bad. And she Her unwavering dedication to factual food reporting was a huge influence too.
Yeah, I loved her. Brett?
Well, I would echo the people that Kim just mentioned. That my earliest influences were music writers that wouldn't really matter to a lot of folks here. Although probably the person I think that has written about food in a way that it has grabbed my lapels more than anyone else, or as much as anyone else, I first read when he was a music writer, and that's Jonathan Gold, who just passed away, sadly and unexpectedly over the summer, who was a writer in Los Angeles. I came across him when he was writing for the LA Weekly, and then later Gourmet when Ruth was there, and he ended at the LA Times. But what I really loved about his writing beyond the prose, which was really beautiful, was just that it was like he just loved LA, and he was like, this is why, and it's because it's full of all these different people and all these different places you can go to, and it really shaped the way that I have lived in any place I've lived. Is like, don't go to the same goddamn places that, go to the place, go park in a neighborhood where you're worried about your car, go challenge yourself as a person and as an eater, and I really am appreciative to him.
Yeah, I think great food writers like him remind us that to be a great food writer, you have to like diversity of people, diversity of food, and like people, the way Bud Trillin did. Yeah. Anybody, you want to turn on the lights and see if anybody's got something they want to say?
There's one right here.
Okay,
stand up.
Kim, you get to do it. I can't see a thing.
I know, it's hard to see.
Identify yourself since we're blind.
What? Oh, hello. Hi. I'm from Dallas, Texas, and about 2 years ago, we had a situation where the Dallas Morning News food critic Leslie Brenner was really attacked by some chefs and restaurateurs for her reviews. And it was a really vicious situation. I don't know if y'all have heard about that, but there is always going to be tension between chefs, restaurateurs, and critics. But how do you feel about that today when we're in such a crowdsourcing information deal where people can blog and Yelp and all that? But the critic comes down to sort of a learned person who is there as his or her job to study and be informed on the restaurant and then report it. And then you have this whole tension with the restaurateurs and chefs really viciously abusing that person. Can you speak to that?
Brett.
It's how to say this. I've always just thought that part of the job, both as a critic and a reporter, I mean, some of the most sort of violent, in a bad way, reactions I've gotten to stories have not been reviews, but have been stories about some other controversial thing. And I just have always considered it part of the deal, and it does get amplified on social media, and you just kind of got to take a deep breath. Something I appreciate as I've gotten older is my father was a politician, and I just remember, where I grew up, he was very prominent, and not everyone liked him, and including journalists, but it never escalated, and I just always think about that. It's like, look, we got a job to do. I just assume other people understand that. And if they don't, I'm sorry.
And I think, too, the thing that people forget is that we're writing stories for our readers, right? So someone's paying us money to go out and do journalism and go out and review a restaurant. And for criticism, it's the very basic service level. So you're ideally telling your readers what you think about this restaurant. And it's for the readers, it's not for the restaurants. And that's always, I think, people are like, well, the food writers are such an important part of the restaurant community, and it always makes me really uncomfortable. I don't really want to be part of the restaurant community. I just want to be there, exploring the world and being a proxy for our readers. And so that's kind of a basic tenet of what I think a lot of critics do, and it's hard, I think, for restaurateurs to understand that. Certainly, you have to be responsible to your sources. You have to be a responsible critic, but it just is amazing to me when a restaurateur is having trouble with their business that they want to kill the critic about it. It seems to me maybe your anger management issue might be reflected in your food somehow. I don't know, but that's just me.
I think going back to the social media thing too, I think it has created a dynamic, particularly among restaurateurs who have spent most of their career, if not all their career, within the social media time, where you have an opportunity to sort of create your own narrative and create your own image. And when someone puts something out there that runs counter to it, their head explodes. They're just like, wait a second, you can't do that, and it's like, we don't work for you, man.
Yeah, it's, although it's true in all forms of journalism.
I'm sure,
we should
sure,
say.
yeah, of course.
I'm sure
But
whether
it's
it's
a
music
new
criticism
dynamic.
We didn't,
or
and
your
not
father
really, not
being
really in this
criticized by the
business to make
political.
friends,
What?
right? We're not in this business to make
Yeah,
friends. I
although it's
suppose.
weird that more
It's a
than
bad way to
saying
make
covering
friends.
politics, in which we are there to hold people accountable, in food there's a slightly more symbiotic relationship in that if you truly devastate the entire food community of a town, it hurts your business as well. So there's got to be more. There probably is a little bit more symbiosis.
Well, the other
than
problem
there
is
with
that it's
political
it's,
journalism.
and it's food. So
Yeah.
unlike politics, people, it's the problem because we're all food people and we all like to want to eat together, and there's ultimately like love underneath all this, right?
Great.
And it's
What a
all
line.
about
Good line.
caring and feeding each other and eating, and it's a very from the heart sort of thing, and so it's different than politics a little bit. So it does get sticky, and you realize that what they're trying to do is serve good food to people, and you're trying to serve your readers, and you like food. It gets a little,
That's what I meant.
it's like a mess for somebody who's as codependent as I am. I'll tell you that.
Yes, sir.
My experience, I've had opportunities where food critics have come in, and I will then follow up after the critique, and I do find that 50 to 60% of what you do have to say is accurate. The side of
That's not high enough.
50 to 60. Batting 500, kid, but okay, all right.
well, I'm looking at it this way, that,
No.
that if it wasn't, and I'm saying that if it was great, you acknowledge it. If it wasn't and needed improvement, I'm here to listen on behalf of the restaurant and my guests. What I have sometimes a hard time with is the fact is that you came in the day after I opened my restaurant. And I do feel that there is a, what I'll say is a grace period for some. And if Emerald was to open tomorrow, that you'd be at his door. And I'm not quite sure where the equality sometimes is. Now, granted, there's the desire to have that story out first on that particular restaurant, but I don't have a problem if you want to do that, but where I do have the problem is the follow-up. And where the follow-up is in this context is, okay, you've reviewed the restaurant, and maybe it wasn't to par, but I'm not quite sure why it should be to par the first day it opened, but coming back 2 weeks later, or a month later, or 6 months, it takes us a long time really to get everything in gear. Even
I
though
think
if
you've
we-
made a good point, and since we
And
are
I
going to
could
have
say,
to
I could
wrap
say
it
that
up.
I've never done that. and
Let me use that to wrap it up, though, on the rules of the road of criticism.
Mm-hmm.
First day, going back, giving second chances. Let both of you talk about that, and we'll use that as a wrap-up here.
I mean, when I started reviewing restaurants back in 1996, it was, I modeled my guidelines on a critic at the Star Tribune in Minneapolis, where I came from, named Rick Nelson. And you go 3 times. You don't make your first visit until the restaurant has been open for between 6 weeks and 2 months. When I wrote criticism a lot, I often would not visit until 3 months. And we would go 3 times. Most times that would give me an opportunity to eat the entire menu. For most of my career, people who've worked for newspapers and city magazines and weekly newspapers have followed that pretty much as much as to their ability. I do think that arriving on the first day thing is very much a new internet phenomenon that, I don't know, I think that's problematic too. I mean, I have no interest in going
And
to
Kim, to
restaurants.
broaden it out slightly, what particular do's and don'ts do you have, or that you think are the rules?
Well, I mean, I think that there is that standard. I just encourage people to pay for good journalism. I don't want to be up here. I mean, I'm happy to take money for a
good
subscription,
point.
but it costs money to go to restaurants 2 or 3 times. It costs money to invest in a writer who will wait 2 months or 3 months, because it does not do our readers any good to go to your restaurant. I mean, although I'm kind of interested on the first day of what the buzz is, but do I want to spend my money at that restaurant? And I think that Alex Brennan last night was saying, do you want to go to the you know, do you want like the restaurant with like the best new chef or like the hottest new place? Like, do you want to go to a doctor who's like the best new doctor or the hottest new doctor? Like, you want them to like have done it for a year or two, right? You want somebody who's like good at what they do. And you're right, it does take time to make a good restaurant. So I think, you know, again, there's the sort of Eater, and God knows Eater does great stuff, but there's that breathless, like plywood's off, let's go in thing that I think can really hurt a lot of restaurants. And then there's, you know, more thoughtful criticism, and that's still happening out there. And I think hopefully you will all support those publications that are doing that.
I think we need to support them all, including Eater, by the way, which I like.
bless Eater.
But they all play a role in the ecosystem, especially the two of you. Kim, Brett, thank y'all very much. Great.
Thank you.
We can take this on the road.
Thanks, man.